Take yourself back to 2012. There had been no new Zombies content released for over a year. The last thing players had gotten to touch was Moon, which had just an insane amount of new gameplay features and innovation, and had also left us with the cliffhanger of our main characters being stranded in space after destroying the Earth. At least for me, Black Ops 2 was the all-time high for hype. It was the only midnight release to a game that I've ever gone to because I just couldn't wait that one extra day it would have taken to play the new Zombies map. When I finally got home and booted the game up, I was greeted with what some people consider to be the worst entry in the entire history of the series. Part of that overwhelming fan reaction was the fact that that insane level of hype would be almost impossible to live up to for even the best map. At the same time though, it's also undeniable that the map itself did have some glaring issues of its own. But now, looking back on it 10 years later, outside of that hype cycle and knowing what to expect, how is it really? What was the developers' thought process when they were creating such a controversial map? And is it really as bad as everyone remembers? Let's dive into how Tranzit came to be. Before even getting into any of the actual gameplay changes or tangible new content, I think the first thing that may have colored people's opinion of this map was the changes it made to the setting and the story side of things. The story of Black Ops 2 took place 10 years after the events of Moon, after the main characters had launched the rockets and we had basically started the full-on zombie apocalypse. Every map up until this point from the first two games had taken place in small, isolated locations, and it was assumed that it was all happening in secret, and everything else in the world was proceeding pretty much as normal. It was a really unique take on the zombie genre, where our main characters were basically a strike force fighting to keep the zombie outbreaks contained, and it was all happening parallel to real history. The Victus storyline, on the other hand, was a much more traditional zombie story, where you had a ragtag group of average people coming together after the end of the world to try and survive the zombie apocalypse, and I think that's a really tough transition to make. Call of Duty Zombies was so successful at least partially because it felt so different from those formulaic stories you usually see in the genre. Already back when World at War came out in 2008, and even more so by 2012, the market for zombie stories was way oversaturated, so to succeed you really needed to find a way to stand out. Earlier maps did this by having such a strong personality with the hidden conspiracy theory vibes mixed with the goofier aspects like the celebrity cameos and the larger-than-life personalities of the main characters. Bringing it back down to earth with a group of more relatable, realistic survivors scavenging and just barely trying to stay alive took away a lot of what made it so unique. It wasn't that it was bad, it was just that now it stood out a lot less when before it had such a strong core identity. In basically every aspect besides the setting though, the one thing that everyone gives Tranzit credit for is that it had a lot of ambition. Some people say that paid off, while others say that's the reason that it failed, but no one denies the sheer amount of content and innovation that Tranzit intended to provide. First up, you got not one, but 3 small-scale survival maps, each one providing a slightly different experience with the bare-bones bus depot in the style of Noctur Untoten, farm with just perks, and town which had a pack-a-punch but was still physically relatively pretty small. On most of these submaps, you could either play classic co-op survival, or you could play the new Grief mode, which set 2 teams of 4 against each other. You couldn't physically hurt the other team yourself, so the gameplay of the mode was a lot different where now you were trying to keep some zombies alive to lure them into killing the other team, while also trying to prevent the other team from getting those kills and getting ahead of you on points. For either of these 2 modes, you could choose from a full matrix of gameplay modifiers, from things like just changing difficulty options or enabling Hellhound spawns, all the way to disabling perks, power-ups, the mystery box, and Pack-a-Punch. Later, a 3rd mode even came out called Turned, which swapped the roles so that players became the zombies and tried to hunt down a single gun-wielding human. Lastly, combining all those submaps together into one big experience gave you Tranzit, which was played across the entirety of Green Run. On top of that, there were still even more modes in various stages of development that never ended up coming out, and all of that behind-the-scenes work stacking up and all the development time that all those different things required was actually pointed to by Treyarch when they admitted that they didn't have the time they needed to fully polish the core experience that actually did end up coming out. And that really shows the dark side of what I mentioned in the video on Moon, about how the developers were always testing the boundaries of the mode and they were never content to release a map that just used the exact same formula as one that had already come out. This map stretched those limits further than they ever had been before, so it absolutely was the most unique in the series, But uniqueness doesn't automatically equate to quality, and a lot of people thought that the directions that it went in were directions away from the core that made Zombies so fun. Now, while all of the different survival maps and modes contributed to the sheer quantity of content, which absolutely does deserve recognition, most of the actual gameplay changes were made on Tranzit specifically, so we'll mostly zoom in on that. The biggest and most obvious change that defines Tranzit, so much so that it's where the name itself came from, is the way it's made up of those smaller survival areas connected by long stretches of empty road that the best way to get across is to take the single bus that goes around the map on a loop. It's a really interesting idea, and I'd be really curious to see if there's a way to really do it justice, that idea of little islands of relative safety and utility, each one with different strengths and weaknesses, like some with lots of perks but no wall guns, or some with very little utility but lots of wide open training space, all connected by that last tier of area that's very dangerous and deadly. But as implemented here, I think most people would agree that it fell short of that vision. Because you were so reliant on the bus to get to different areas, when you needed something from somewhere else on the map and the bus wasn't immediately available to you, the feeling you usually felt was frustration, which really isn't something you're aiming for when making a game. Instead of these cool moments of tension where you feel like you have to skillfully hold out until you can finally escape, you more so just feel bored and annoyed as you just wait for the bus to slowly finish its entire loop and finally come pick you up. The alternative to just sitting around and doing nothing was, of course, to try to make the trip on foot. The issue there was that the spaces between areas weren't really intended to be viable gameplay zones. You had the fog, making it so you couldn't see anything 10 feet in front of you, and then you had the denizens, a new enemy type that only appeared when you were in the fog and attacked you by attaching to your head, slowing you down, taking away your ability to shoot your gun, clawing at you, eventually downing you if you didn't melee them off first, all the while allowing the zombies to catch up to you. It all added up to make traversing the fog a very slow, tedious, and frustrating experience. A common fan theory is that these were intentional design decisions built into the map to discourage players from going into the fog and slowing them down if they chose to do so, because consoles at the time couldn't handle loading a map that big and having it all be visible and accessible at all times. There definitely were some performance concerns, but Treyarch also never stated that that was the only reason. I think, largely, the design was intentional and not born purely out of limitations. The goal was to have those islands of safety connected by more dangerous and less viable connective tissue. I think more so what it was that lack of polish shining through. If you were still discouraged from going into the fog because it was difficult, but that challenge was implemented in a fun way instead of just being annoying, or if there was a good risk-reward system for spending time in more dangerous areas, I think this idea could have a lot of potential. As it exists today, though, the experience of playing Tranzit is a lot of either just waiting around or doing things that just aren't fun at a gameplay level. The other big revolutionary change, and the one that actually did end up sticking around and really having a huge impact on the future of zombies, was the introduction of buildables. These were intended to support the new story of post-apocalyptic survival, where the world has fallen into ruin and basic utilities don't work anymore. You have to build makeshift tools yourself out of everyday items. Instead of turrets and electric traps being built into the map, you had to scavenge around and build them yourself. Basic map features like the pack-a-punch and the power switch had fallen apart, and you had to reconstruct them before you could use them. The shield that was first seen here became an integral part of almost every single map going forward, enabling another dimension of gameplay progression alongside perks and weapons, where you could now upgrade your defense as well as your offense. Even the wonder weapon for the map was a buildable, with the infamous jet gun being built out of pieces that were scattered across the entire massive map. Now, this gun did have some major flaws. It technically did infinite damage, but it could only kill so many zombies at a time, and because it pulled the entire horde towards you regardless, the stragglers could still get a couple hits in before being killed. Also, again, theoretically, it had infinite ammo, but after 6 continuous seconds of firing, it would overheat. To cool it back down, you had to not only not fire it, but also hold it in your hands so you couldn't do anything else either. To cool down from a full charge, it took over 1.5 minutes, which when you compare that to the 6 seconds that it actually fired for, and also consider that that entire cooldown time is basically non-gameplay because you can't fire any other guns, that ratio just makes no sense. An easy fix for this, in my eyes, would be to allow the cooldown to occur even if you put it away and started using your other weapons. It would be more like an ult move on a timer that you pull out only in case of extreme emergency, a lot more in the vein of the specialist weapons from Black Ops 4. That way, the jet gun could still have that design philosophy of not being a primary weapon and more of a resource to be spent and managed, while still allowing you to engage with the game when not using it. And, of course, the last fun part of the jet gun was the fact that if you mistimed it and allowed it to fully overheat, it would explode back out into its individual pieces and force you to take them all back into town to rebuild it. Overall, the buildables really were a great addition to the game, which is why they stuck around so long. They give the game a lot more depth, they provide more goals to the player, and they reward the player for learning the map's setup process. But their implementation in this map, with the jet gun being the worst offender, highlights what I think is the last piece of the puzzle as to why Tranzit felt so inconsistent and frustrating at times. For context, in those early Black Ops 2 maps, you could only carry one buildable piece at a time, and you had to take it to the build table and install it before picking up another one. You don't really notice this too much to start when you're just building the turbine in the spawn room, but the pieces for the jet gun, for example, are spread out across the entire map. If you have a knowledgeable and well-organized team of 4, you can pretty easily pick up all 4 pieces, and by the first time you get to town, you'll already be able to build it. But working solo, or even with less knowledgeable teammates, you have to take 4 full back and forth trips across the entire map, all for a gun that really isn't that great to begin with. So that's that last puzzle piece I wanted to talk about. This map feels so purpose-built for a coordinated team of 4 skilled players that it feels like they almost completely neglected the casual and solo experiences. I mentioned in the video on 5 that I think one of the reasons that map didn't get as much traction as some others was the fact that it was so small and chaotic, it was hard to fit more than one person, so it was hard to hang out with your friends. Tranzit feels like it kinda went too far in the other direction, where it almost felt actively hostile to solo players. Only being able to carry one buildable piece at a time, especially when that was the only way to get the wonder weapon, was one part of it. You could also only carry one finished buildable, but the electric trap and the turret both required the turbine to operate. The ideal way to use these is to have 2 players working together, one with the trap and one with the turbine, setting it up in a high traffic area. If you're on your own though, you have to do some creative juggling to do anything other than just leaving them running right at the bench where you build them. To open access to Pack-a-Punch, you had to set a turbine down in the power station and a corresponding door in the town would open. It's trivially easy if you have multiple people working together. You just have one person wait at power station and open the door on request. If you're not getting any help though, this means you have to get your own turbine, put it down at the power station, probably miss the bus and have to run through the fog, all the while just having to hope that your turbine doesn't break or get attacked by a zombie before you get to where you need to go in town. Now, in fairness, this is actually an improvement on the system from the last couple maps, Shangri-La and Moon, where it was actually physically impossible to pack a punch with unhelpful teammates, but it definitely didn't fully fix the problem either. The new perk for the map was also a part of this trend, with the machine not even showing up in solo games. Solo players just straight up didn't get this new content. Tombstone Soda allowed you to, if you went down, drop your inventory as a pickup that you could go back and retrieve if your teammates managed to finish the round without you. Basically, you get all your guns and perks back, minus Tombstone itself. While there is the argument that buying it is just being pessimistic and using up a perk slot just to admit that you're eventually going to fail, I do still think it's a good option to have for those people who want to avoid how unfun that death spiral is once you go down once and how frustrating it is to try and build back up mid-game. Except, of course, if you're playing with bad teammates who don't know to end the round near where you died, because then your pickup will slowly fade out without you being able to reach it in time. And if you're playing solo, it's less than useless. When I first talked about those old pack-a-punch systems on Shangri-La and Moon that forced the whole lobby to work together, I mentioned that I do totally get the impulse to try to build the game in a way that encourages teamwork and rewards players finding synergy. But there really needs to be a middle ground, because it's also not fun to fully punish an otherwise very skilled player just because they happen to be playing solo or with less knowledgeable teammates. It really is hard to list all these flaws out in a row like this because there really are some good additions on Tranzit in my opinion. For example, the other partially new perk was the upgrade to Double Tap. The original perk was a really great way to upgrade your firepower when it was introduced back in Verrückt, but with the introduction of the Pack-a-Punch and an increasing number of new perks competing for limited slots, it had kind of fallen to the bottom of the tier list. The upgrade to 2.0 kept the fire rate increase, but also made it so that every bullet basically did double damage, taking it straight up to being one of the best perks past the early point building rounds, which was a great way to keep the perk selection competitive. There was also the new system of perma-perks, hidden upgrades that rewarded a skilled player for doing something difficult or helped out newer players who kept struggling on the same thing over and over. Some of them duplicated the effects of existing perks, like increasing your health or making your revives faster, while other ones just did a collection of random miscellaneous things, like making your barriers that you rebuilt take longer to tear down, or making it so that during an insta-kill, you just had to get near zombies to kill them, you didn't have to attack at all. Speaking of things carrying over between games, you also had the new bank and weapon locker systems, which allowed you to store a gun or hundreds of thousands of points in one game, and then withdraw it in an entirely different game, either on Tranzit or on any of the future Victus maps that came out. Admittedly, it does break the pure meritocracy that I love so much about Zombies, where every game is its own self-contained little experience. You always start from zero on an equal playing field. At the same time, with all of the other map features that I mentioned that are fighting to keep this from being a casual experience, if you want to hop in with friends and have a less stressful time, this is a nice way to enable that, and if you really don't want to engage with it, it's pretty easy to not be affected by it. As much as people love to hate the lava cracks around the map that tick you for small amounts of damage and give zombies the ability to explode, I think the core idea at least is good, of adding some variety to training and forcing you to think a little to time your jumps and watch your distance instead of just being able to go completely on autopilot. There's so much more too. You have the first appearance of Double Pack-a-Punch, which at this point only changes attachments. The branching Easter egg paths, where you could follow either Richtofen or Maxis's instructions, which made you feel like you had agency in the story and added a lot of replay value. The Avogadro, a new boss enemy that could only be damaged by melee or one very specific tactical equipment, which made sure that you were engaging with all of the different gameplay tools and systems available to you. The idea of those same EMP grenades being super dangerous to use in regular gameplay because they could disable perk and pack-a-punch machines, which ended up being perfect for grief mode when you wanted to do those things to the other players. Like I said, it's undeniable that Tranzit had ambition. For all its faults, it definitely can't be accused of not trying hard enough. The intention with Black Ops 2's launch was to provide the widest variety of content yet, and make sure there was something there for everyone. Looking at it from that perspective, a lot of the frustrations with Tranzit were intended to be alleviated by playing some of the other experiences in Green Run. Those other modes and maps don't have the same problems with the big empty map or the over-reliance on teamwork. But, whether this perception is fair or not, Town and Farm and the rest weren't really seen as equals to Tranzit, they were seen more as secondary filler, with Tranzit being the main course. It was the only one with the wonder weapon, the Easter egg, the new characters. Like it or not, Tranzit was the true next evolution in the Zombies map series. So, instead of feeling like you had a fulfilling selection of casual options and then the more hardcore one, it more just felt like you were always compromising when choosing a map, always missing out on something. At the same time, there were also a lot of fresh, new ideas buried in there. Some working out better than others, but overall there was a lot of good to balance out the bad. And playing Tranzit and the rest of Green Run, you really feel those ups and downs. When it works, it's great, like when you're playing with a bunch of friends and you have one of those frenzied, chaotic moments where you're all trying to get to the bus before it leaves and you get split up. But then, every once in a while, you really hit a wall with one of those frustrating parts. Whether it's running through the corn maze to try and get to Noctur and Toten to try and find a jet gun part and just slowly and tediously mashing B to deal with the denizens, or getting to town and finding out that your turbine had broken and you had to take 4 full minutes mid-round just to open Pack-a-Punch again. I really do think it's unfair to just write it off as a purely bad map. I think it did a lot of things right, and a lot of the hate that it got was because of contextual things that were at least partially out of its control. At the same time, it's completely unrealistic to just ignore some of the major flaws the map has. It's a hard map to categorize, it doesn't really fit in any bucket, which is why I really respect Tranzit, at least conceptually. The formula for the mode was nowhere near stale yet, and if they really wanted to, they could have played it a lot safer and most of the audience would have been happy. But they were still committed to taking those big swings and always being creative and never complacent. And those big swings and that philosophy paid off, because while this particular map is flawed being the first to try a lot of those new things, so many of those ideas that started here are still having ripple effects on the mode a decade later.